Hello, and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. Have you ever wondered what a conversation design team consists of within any organization and how conversation AI startups should go about building a conversation design team? In today's episode, Shamala Prayaga speaks with Obaid Ahmed about this very topic, building conversation design teams within an organization. Obaid Ahmed is founder and CEO of Botmock, the leading chatbot design collaboration platform. Before Botmock, Obaid co-founded a design consultancy firm, OAK, where he led the technology and design teams to deliver over 400 projects. Today, Obaid is concentrating on building on the success of Botmock to make it a real driver in building the next generation of conversational apps. Obaid and Shamala discuss building a conversation design team and linguistics and psychologists' importance in conversational design. They also dive deeper into different parts of conversation design, including text-to-speech prompt tuning.
Welcome, Obaid.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
So, Obaid, tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so I'm a software developer by training, and I spent some time working at Blackberry and IBM. And then I ran a consulting agency where we built all sort of software for mobile and web for many different companies. And now I run a company called Botmock.
Amazing. Tell us a little bit more about Botmock.
Yeah, so Botmock is a design and prototyping tool. Essentially, what we do is we enable teams for building conversational experiences to go from an idea all the way from planning and prototyping and then go into developer handover. And in all of those phases, be able to work together in teams so that they can have a single source of truth, understand what exactly is going to be built, how the experience is going to unfold eventually, and be able to test it before they actually go into development phase.
Is it more of a designer-centric tool or a developer-centric tool?
So it's a designer-centric tool, but there's a major piece that does help developers. If you think about traditionally how conversation design projects typically go, they are very developer-focused, right? So they start with some sort of development tool. They are going directly into all these training phrases and intents and entities and content, and it sort of works really hard for design teams and content teams to work with that. And especially the challenge of actually building a good experience gets lags behind. What we do is we actually flip it around a little bit. So we give the control to the design teams to figure out what sort of experience they want. And when they're ready to actually give that and hand it over, instead of doing that in Excel files or Visio or Lucid charts, they're now doing it in a much more easier way, which is through our API. All the design documents are importable in different formats, and developers can keep on building on top of that. And from developers' perspective, they no longer have to restrict access or try to figure out, okay, exactly what is changing, and I have to manually go into my Dialogflow or Watson bot and change something. So we streamline the entire process where the design team have their space to work with, and they can bring in the developers to help them. And then vice versa, when the developers are ready, they're not getting sort of Excel files anymore.
Okay, so what that means is if, let's say, you are designing a weather intent, so the designer is going to design the entire voice flow, like what the user says, and then how would the bot respond, how are the error scenarios and all of those things. That's it. But then the developer is going to do the integration with the weather API and then marry the flows with the database or backend. That's how is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when you're designing that kind of flow, you may start from an intent, but it splits down into much more complicated flows. The edge cases that you may want to handle. How do we handle digressions? How do you handle certain other complicated use cases within that intent? All of that from a design perspective, you can do that upfront in a tool like Botmock and be able to test it, right? Test it within the browser, be able to run it, be able to interact with that prototype. And the interaction can happen in a very deep layer or very shallow. So what I mean by that is that you can actually have a very hard-coded sort of responses from the user to test out the flow. And then as you're going forward, there's other information that the developers would need to make that smarter. So what ways can somebody ask for weather? Can they say, what's the weather in Ottawa? Or is it snowing in Ottawa? Is it raining in Ottawa? And all those variations of it. they can actually train that data directly or build that data in Botmock and be able to test it out. And then when they hand it over to development team, their job is to now take that experience and into whatever platform they're building it in and continue working to make it deployable. So we offer all sort of ways for the designers to actually even mimic API calls if they need to in their prototype. So their prototype can go from being very basic, high level, to very high fidelity very quickly. And that enables them to figure out those design mistakes early on, because those are extremely expensive to fix if they are already being developed and deployed. Because now you're learning in real time and then coming back and saying, oh, we didn't think of all these edge cases. With Botmock, you can actually do all of that stuff, do user testing, do everything upfront from a design perspective. And then by the time your developer gets it, it's actually very well thought out.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea. And like you mentioned, the whole process of putting things in Excel sheet and then mapping the intents and utterances and like all of those things, a lot of those could be automated. You can quickly create flows instead of going through those complex data and things, which is really good. So, wait, tell me one thing. Like, if someone is starting a new conversation design company or like starting their initiative in voice or chatbot or any such things, how do you think they should go about building a conversation design team?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what we typically see in a lot of different sort of compose of teams in different sizes and shapes and sort of use we're tackling, but essentially this is a team sport. So you need people who can write creative content and be able to figure out different ways of interactions and how customer engagement can happen. You need somebody who understands how to design intents and train data around it. You know, it's an art to get a understanding of users or NLU data sets around it, especially when you are designing a flow where the user can freeform interact with it. So figuring out what that data will look like and visualizing it, being able to test it and inquiring with the content itself. And then domain experts who need to come in and say, okay, this is what we are building towards. So if you're building a weather bot, you have all sort of different people who can come together and say, okay, different hats that must be worn. And you need to account for all of them as a design level. But then you have your development teams who now have to look at that and say, okay, how do we really deploy this? How do we build this voice experience? And especially if you're building omni-channel, how do they orchestrate their layer where this can be experienced on voice, this can be experienced in a text chatbot in Facebook or WhatsApp, and they need to be involved early on in the design process because your content team is not writing one content and it's getting delivered to all of these different channels. They're probably going to be writing different content for each channel, customized for that channel. So if it's a voice only experience or it's a voice plus Facebook Messenger experience, their ability to do certain things and how they show information, how much information can they say in voice experience versus non-voice experience is different. So they all need to work together. And typically that's what we see. And eventually you also need somebody who can test it for you. And they need to understand all the different design documents and different variations that you have been thinking about, and then be able to go beyond that and say, okay, how do we really test it now before we release it to public?
That's amazing. So what you're saying is there has to be a conversation designer, there has to be some NLP or data expert as well, and a product manager and a developer, like all these team working together, right?
Absolutely. Yeah,
How about
absolutely. And we've
researchers?
seen
How about
some.
researchers? Like when we start something, I've seen like sometimes people expect designer to be jack of all trade. But here in conversation design, these are clear roles which we are saying should exist and everyone should be responsible for their own. So where does research play into all of this?
So research for different roles it is important. And as I said, there are people who are going to be doing all the data sets around intent training data that you're sort of putting together. There's a lot of good research needed on that end. Based on even content writers need to do some sort of research around, is there existing set of questions or queries or things that use cases that we can handle, our bots should be able to tackle, and how do they actually take all of that information either through different sources that the company already has or coming up with those early use cases around it. So a lot of these things can happen, and what we've seen is that there's almost like that double hat that everybody's wearing from their perspective. There's a little research role and then implementation. A lot of teams that we work with in enterprise settings do have very specific people who are doing training data research. So they are looking at all of this in life cycle and say, okay, what if these are the kind of use cases we're going to tackle? What data set do we need to prepare for that? How do we train our systems best for this? Yeah, like if you've been building a banking for your customers, there's a lot of data that you all probably already have, and from the call center to the users doing, what are the apps that they're using, and how do you bring all of that to your surface and say, this is how the information will be provided to us, this is how the user can do queries. And that is like a overlapping between content and data training team to work together on that.
This is interesting. So a lot of collaboration for sure, which I'm seeing here, and it doesn't feel like one person is responsible or one person will successfully be able to do everything. So in data quite a few times and like how we have to map the intents and all of those kind of things. So there are different ways. You also mentioned that like for weather, there are different ways the user can ask for something. What is the weather and will it rain or do I need an umbrella, right? How do you identify all of these different utterances for a specific intent? Like these are the different ways the user can say something. Do you conduct any kind of studies or do you just do it based on your understanding or what is the best way to go about it?
I mean, the best thing is to actually look at what the user is already saying in terms of data set. So if you have any existing interaction points with your customer, it's critical for the team to look at that data and say, what are people asking? How are they interacting with it? And if you, one of the most common examples that we see in most chatbots right now is customer service. And the reason that everybody jumps onto that use case right away is because you can look at your call center data and say, okay, what are the tier 1, tier 2 support calls that we can automate? Just start from there. What kind of questions are we getting the most and how are we answering them? And how successfully are we answering them? And it's not like that data is super hidden. It's just that sometimes we're not measuring the right parts of the data. And so it takes a little bit of an art and skill to actually look at that data set and say, okay, these are the ones that we're doing pretty good job on, and we should really automate that. Or these are the kind of questions that we get asked repeatedly. How do we answer that? And then the next phase around that is, okay, what are the context switching within this conversation? So if you're building a chatbot, let's say, again, on the banking side of things, there's a lot of examples, there's a lot of interaction the user can do, right? They have a set of data that they're querying for you. But in that, there's a context management that you need to have. You need to understand how are they actually, how long the session would be, what kind of typical questions they ask, how do you pre-compute that answers for them or bubble that up? And also, how do you get somebody to understand the depth of your bot or the lack of the depth of your bot? Because users can sometimes not know what the potential of the bot really is that this voice interaction can provide me. They are not used to these experiences sometimes. So they use a very shallow use cases. And one thing that we have seen that successful bots can do, or successful voice experience as well, is that they bring the users slowly into their world and teach them how to interact further. So maybe they ask for a very basic use case first, but from there you can actually teach them that there are other things that they can do, and how do you actually get them on board on that. So there's a lot of that research that needs to happen, but it really starts from what data set you already have. And that's usually, there's plenty of it. If you have a website, people are already asking you support questions through that. You can automate those starting off. And then as you learn more and more from that other use cases, how do you go beyond tier 2 support and with more complex experiences? And also understanding that maybe your bot doesn't need to solve all the complex use cases under the sun because the user just wants to use it for those quick access information and that kind of information hierarchy around it. Some of the challenges that we see on the voice experiences is also that the interaction that users have with a Alexa device, because of the nature of the device being in a public place in their home, it's not a private sort of conversation that they're having with it. They're very conscious about what kind of use cases or what kind of questions they can ask and can't ask. So as a designer and as a data science team, you have to understand where the experience is going to live and then map accordingly, because nobody probably wants to just ask Alexa for their bank balance right away, but they want to ask other questions to your bank bot.
Yeah, very well said. Definitely, these are all very important points to consider for sure. And I think like exploration starts from home. If you already have these things, that's fine. Like maybe if a company like food wants to automate their customer support, they have these questions and all. How about someone who wants to just start new, like a startup
Yeah.
who wants to
Mhm.
build their own? They have no data or no clue about how to get started.
Yeah, in that case, what we usually recommend is to create some prototypes. Don't worry about the depth of those prototypes, but create some sample space, come up with some use case that you think are your customers are looking to tackle. And then one thing that we rigorously sort of advocate in Botmock is the ability to do the design testing as early as possible. So once you have created a few use cases that you believe are the ones that your customers are going to need, and you've mapped out some of the journeys on that, and what interaction will take care, they don't have to be comprehensive, but they have to be enough that you can present to somebody and say, hey, if you were to do this, how would you go about doing this? Here's a sample conversation chatbot that you can interact with and give me feedback. Similar to what we do with web and mobile apps. You create some screens, some visuals around it, you put them together, whether it's a PowerPoint test or whether it is like a point and click test. You do those tests as early as possible to understand are you going in the right path or not. So user testing, user research becomes super important because now you don't want to run blind towards development. You want to get some sort of concrete data set, and you can generate that by creating these almost like fake chatbots that they can quickly interact with, the users can, and you can do focus groups and they can give you feedback on it and say, if you were to build this as an experience for us to do XYZ task, then this is the gap that we are seeing in it. And it's super easy to do. It's actually relatively cheaper to do that than to actually go all the way through in terms of building a use case all the way into a voice bot or chat bot, and then realizing that you were going in the wrong direction altogether. A lot of these tools, again, they exist for web and mobile experiences, and now we are building that towards conversational experiences as well.
That's great. So build early on and then test as soon as possible. So how frequently should someone
Absolutely.
try out?
Short answer is as frequently as possible, but there's definitely a certain point in your journey of designing the experience where you feel comfortable you can go outside of it. The way we think about it is that your early test usually happens within your team. If you can actually get your team members who are supposedly more close to the problem to do a blind test on your chatbot and they like it, and that's a good first step, then you can go beyond that and start giving to outside users and stakeholder teams a little bit outside the bubble. So you can go from inside out approach and start getting more and more data. And that means that every time you go outside of your bubble into the next phase of the bubble of the user group, you have improved your design as well a little bit because people will start giving you feedback on content, the flow, the information hierarchy, where they're getting stuck. A lot of people, a lot of bots actually that we have used personally that I've used, I get stuck not because the bot was not able to understand the NLU part of my conversation, but the content led me to a wrong direction and then I got stuck somewhere. And I was trying to figure out how to go back and forth in the conversations. Having a mobile app where you're getting stuck by and not understanding where exactly is that option that you're looking for. And those are things that can be adjusted very early on and can be super helpful to find out by just doing basic user testing. Now, a lot of those techniques have been read out loud with your sort of colleagues or your stakeholders. But from a user's experience perspective, nothing beats than them actually interacting with a conversational agent, just like they would normally do in production. So the faster you can get to that point, the better it is.
So you mentioned testing, right? And early on with your colleagues. So do you see any biases when we are doing that? For example, they already
Yeah.
know a little bit about the project and they have some vested interest in it. So do you see the data being biased?
Yeah, and it can be because as I said, I mean, they're very close to the data set and they know exactly what the right sort of utterances are to get through everything. But at the same time, as a designer, you can create blind tests for them. And those blind tests can be designed in a way that sort of forces them to take a path that they may not be familiar with, or something that actually throws them off a little bit in terms of what the experience is. We also see that while there's a little bit bias in it, it actually starts giving you some sort of concrete feedback on the fact that even with the bias, if the experience was not good enough for them, then that's like the really good sign to catch in that stage because you want to make sure that by the time you get to the people who don't have the domain expertise, or not close to the data set of that particular use case, they should have a little bit more streamlined experience around it. How are you asking for information? At what time are you asking for the information? What are you doing with that information? All of that starts mattering. You can adjust for that bias early on by creating very specific tasks for them. Instead of giving them a sort of blind test to go through, you can tell them, like, we look at this as an example, the pizza ordering bot. If you're designing that, you can give somebody a task and say, hey, you have 4 minutes to order a pizza. Here you go. Use this conversation experience to do that. And you expect them to reach that goal faster and earlier. But at the same time, when they're going through that sort of test, they can bubble up some issue and say, I didn't expect this option. Why is this here? And they can get sort of misdirected or distracted by other options, and you can adjust for that too.
So you're saying, like, with these early on testing, you can test the interactions, you can adjust the conversational flows and stuffs like that. So when we are doing testing, what kind of testing is it? Is it, you said blind testing, blindfold testing kind of thing. So is it using the interface? Is it paper prototype based, where it is just like some voice prompts being played to the user? So what would you recommend people to do?
So we have a user testing component within Botmock. So I'm a little biased about this, but we built that exactly for that reason, because we started seeing customers were coming to us and saying, look, we are doing these testing where we actually have the audios being played. We bring somebody into a focus group, we play a clip for them, they respond, and then we basically play in the clip based on what the response was. And then we find that the testing wasn't comprehensive and complete. It was very shallow testing. It did get some things done, but essentially the user did not really have a good experience. So they couldn't really tell you if this was the right experience overall to be built for that. So in Botmock, you can actually design the entire experience and then send somebody a link that they can actually interact with. And they can interact with voice-only experiences as well as chatbots. So they are no longer they're no longer disconnected from the actual experience. It sounds like an Alexa experience. They are talking to us something that sounds and acts just like Alexa would do. So they can really start giving you more concrete feedback of where did they time out? What did happen? Did they ramble on for 5 minutes about their inquiry and the bot went to some other phase, or the reply from the bot was way too long and they were like, I don't understand what you were saying, so can you repeat that? And all scenarios that are critical that most likely are not happening in a real time or in like face-to-face testing where you're playing audio, because people's attention span changes and how they're interacting with your bot changes too. So you can do also these tests directly in Botmock, and you can do them free from, you can do blind test completely, you just leave them free in the experience and let them explore. Or you can have it goal-based, so you can actually tell them that, hey, I want you to do this particular task in this test, and you can measure how long a group of users it's taking them to achieve that test. And when you start collecting that data out of thousands and hundreds and thousands of it, you start seeing a very good pattern of where people are getting lost and not. So the data gets much more valuable and you get the data much faster as well.
So with this kind of testing where you're sending them a link and the users are interacting, should the designer be observing? Like usually what we do in any other kind of test is we are actively observing what's happening and where the user struggled or where they paused and things like that. Also, we are seeing the interactions, right? So
Mhm.
in a test like this where you send them a link, it's all automated. You don't need a designer observing them actively. Or are there chances that we can do the other way around as well, where the observation is happening in parallel?
Yeah, so you can do it either way. We have customers who actually bring people in, but they observe them, but they're giving them the control with the chatbot experience that Botmock has built for them. So they're chatting with something and then observing them. We're actually building all of those features directly into our solution too. But even if you don't get to observe that, we actually capture all the session history of what time did they message, how long did it take between messages and all that. So that real-time playback starts giving you a much better input into what exactly happened, right? How long did they wait before they started the conversation again, or they replied? Did they interrupt bot and try to answer the question before the bot could even finish? If that is happening more often, why is that happening? And there's a lot of that cues that the user may not tell you in the report, but when you're looking at the session history, when you're hearing them back, in the playback, you start realizing that this is where we can improve significantly and improve the experience significantly as well. You should always have some sort of observation going on, like early on, having the visual cues of what people are doing, their body language, their way they're interacting with your bot, how are they interacting with it. All of those are critical pieces. And as you want to do that on scale, the speed of interaction starts giving you a lot more data as well.
So I feel like the first one which you're saying is more of an analytics thing, right? So during the testing, you are capturing all the different things like how long the session lasted or if they were struggling and all of those things, which is good. So when the designer, conversation designer goes through the data, all they get is user by user, or do they get overall thing? These many people had problem, or how do they get the data to synthesize it?
So they get the data in both formats. So we give them a cumulative report because that starts giving them a much better picture overall. If you can look at the average session length or average time for somebody to complete a particular task, that starts giving you a much better idea around what is really happening. And you can take care of the outliers automatically, and you can hone down on the data into specific user as well and say, okay, what about this particular user who, let's say, completed a task in the 90th percentile? What was their interaction versus somebody who completed in less than 50th percentile? And that data starts giving them a much better picture, and to be able to compare and understand why is one user is doing better than the other one. But doing that cumulative reporting first is definitely more useful because you start doing this at scale and you start getting much better high level ideas around overall how is our cohort of testers doing. So we have customers who do about thousands of test sessions for their chatbots in one go, and when they do that, they start getting much better picture of, are we even ready for development with this experience or not? Because if your data set is showing you cumulatively that people are struggling to complete certain tasks that you think should be trivial, then there's something wrong with your design, and you can address that right there and then by understanding that. Now, one of the key things that was different and hard to do from a design perspective, especially conversation design right now, is that you're measuring all of this usually in production after you roll chatbots out. So there's very little of this in-depth analysis you can do at a design level. And even if you could do that, what do you do with this data? How do you understand that? Is it a content problem or is it an NLU trained data problem? And we bring all of that up for you because we tell you that the intent was understood properly, but this is the intent that we understood at this point. The user maybe was trying to give us a help intent and you did not account for that. Or they were trying to do XYZ and you did not account for it. So why was there a significant group of users who were trying to hit this particular intent and this point in your conversation? And we've seen customers who tweak their content and just their content, and they're able to mitigate that issue because they figure out that the user is being led into that intent because of the way the content was structured. So a lot of that is preventable, but if you have the data and you need to, that's where sort of the analysis comes in, where the writing team, the content team, and the data science team all needs to work together and say, okay, this is what we are seeing right now. How do we actually interpret it back into our words? And you can see it both ways. You can see a very high level photo or picture of it, and then you can go down to a particular user and say, how is this tester doing it?
Interesting. So tell me more about, you mentioned writers, you should also have writers in the team. So what kind of skill sets should the writer have?
It's at the end of the day, this is a creative writing job, right? You need somebody who understands how to make these experiences engaging, especially voice only experiences, and also true for chatbots really. But voice experiences are hard to design. They need to be engaging. They need to keep somebody actively engaged in those short bursts of conversation, and you need somebody who can write creatively and can understand what the medium and the restrictions on the medium are. We have seen customers who, again, have like essential to creative writers, script writers, screenwriters who actually have understanding of how to actually write dialogues between customers and users. The way people talk is very different than the way people write. So the writers need to understand the mode that the user is going to be listening in. So you can take a very complex answer that you may get from your banking bot in a text chatbot, but if you try to read it out loud on Alexa, chances are that the user's already checked out of that experience. So the creative writing part comes in where they can take that complicated sort of text and convert it more friendly, conversational, audio only experience where it's easy for the consumer to consume it and understand what you're trying to say. So it's one of those critical roles and roles that we are seeing a lot of teams are preparing for because it's a hard one. It's extremely hard it's a very different kind of design structure too. So you need somebody who understands words and the relationship with audio and how they exist on screen and how are people reading them and how are they getting information out of them. And they also play, by the way, a role in helping the training data team because they can tell them different ways that the user is going to give information back to them. And sometimes that is hard for just simply looking at it and saying, this is how our NLU engine should be designed. The writers can give you all what sort of variety and input on that too. So it becomes a nice collaboration between the two teams.
I see. Yeah, definitely. I can see that happening. I do hear people saying if you come from linguistics background or you come from psychology background, it really helps because you are able to understand how users think or how they may react to certain things. What do you think? Like, is it mandatory? Because I did realize that some companies have started adding like linguistics and psychologists in their team. So, do you think a team should comprise of those, or are those optional roles?
I think those are good roles to have. They play a critical role, especially linguistics, right? Somebody who understands the complexity of the language structure around it. And we have a team member on our end who is a linguistic expert, and she used to build chatbots before, voice experience before she joined Botmock. And it's amazing how the language plays a big role in making something easier and some complicated answers that you may have that needs to be understood and relate back to the user from an emotional perspective, and also understanding how the user is talking to you, especially in voice experiences and in some cases text as well. So, for example, if somebody starts typing to you in all caps, as humans, we perceive it very differently in our head in terms of what the user is trying to say. If I said I need help in all caps versus I say I need help in lowercase, from a text sort of NLU engine's perspective, it's the same. But from a linguistic perspective, one is a little bit more aggressive than the other one. So you can actually fine tune for those things as well, and especially again, how you're communicating back. Some of these experiences, especially text chatbots where the use of emojis and all these come in handy, people who understand language can really help your team understand and deliver really good experiences with a mix of nice text, emojis, images, and all of these visual cues that can help the conversation move forward. So I think if the team can, they should definitely have one or the other, more likely a linguistic person experts who can help the team understand and navigate this complex world of language and audios and all that too. There's actually a commercial by, I think it's Lowe's who runs a commercial in Canada at least, about on a radio where it's like they say the same sentence but in different tones and it means completely different. It's like somebody walks in and says, wow, look at your kitchen, versus somebody comes in and says, wow, look at your kitchen. And it's the same sentence. And the way they deliver it, and it's an audio medium, so the way they deliver it paints a completely different picture in your head right away. And that's the power of voice that you need to understand and play with.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I think like people, a UX designer or just a writer may not be able to that extent. Like you mentioned, all caps. For me, all caps, I've seen using people using all caps when they are yelling at someone or like they want you to focus on that, like you mentioned. So definitely,
Yeah.
yeah, those kind of things can make a lot of difference. You did mention emojis, like how we can use the emojis or emoticons to express certain things in a chat. When we are designing for voice, how can we relate to that? For example, you said, wow, look at your kitchen versus, wow, look at your kitchen. So these are two different ways of saying. So if I have to respond back or the voice assistant have to respond back, excuse me. Yeah. So
Yeah, it's the text plus the pitch and the delivery of that audio that needs to run analysis on. And it's a hard thing because a lot of our platforms are actually not tuned for that right now. It's hard to do those kind of real-time analysis and understand. We do sentiment analysis of understanding if the user's tone in general of the sentence is it positive, negative, and you can reply differently. But I've yet to see a good experience on voice only where they were able to take that kind of visual cues on audio cues and be able to understand and respond back accordingly. Because it's a hard problem to solve. But I think as we are making progress, I think if we account for that in our design phase, then we can build the technology around it too, and understand exactly once we do understand that what sort of tone and pitch and variations in their, for example, people start yelling and increasing their volume when they get frustrated with the electric experiences. And I'm pretty sure if somebody can measure that and say they were talking at this volume 10 and all of a sudden they are like at 100, that they're frustrated. They're asking the same question that we don't have the answer to, but we need to change our response to it because clearly whatever response we're giving them is not working for them. So they keep on asking the same thing, but different volume and pitch. So a lot of that plays, it's like an emoji, but in audio format. You will notice that people in text chatting would do the same thing by putting a smiley face to seem a little bit more polite, or they'll put an angry face emoji or something else that sort of gives a visual cue to the reader that, look, you're not getting my point. And in audio, it's the pitch, it's the delivery of the audio that kind of acts like the emoji.
I see. So it's all about the text-to-speech tuning and how they do it. More
Exactly. Yeah.
cool. So does your platform allow for those kind of things where people can tune it and they can test it, or it is just the basic conversation aspects which people can test it out?
So right now we do only basic conversation aspects of it. We are working on some of these advanced sort of customization features as well. But engine to engine depends, and there's a lot of variations on it. But in the future, we'll probably be able to give more control to designers on that.
So when you say engine to engine, is it like Alexa operates a different way or Google operates a different way and they support only some basic SSML elements, or is it something completely different from the text to speech standpoint?
Yeah, so a lot of it is to do with the devices and the mode that the user is interacting with you on. So does the device that particular channel give you that kind of data set around it? Do they give you access to the audio? Can you do some analysis on it? Or do they provide any analysis like this on it? And we are seeing a lot of our customers who are building voice experiences on their own custom platforms. So their own web-based or mobile experiences are voice enabled now. So they may be using completely different third-party engines to do all these text to speech. And some of them are powerful, some of them are not so yet. It really depends on the use case and what the team is really exploring towards. One thing that we realized is that the phase one of these sort of the wave one of these experiences are going to be agnostic of this. They're just going to try to build an experience with an average sort of consumer. And then as they get more and more data set around it, they can start fine tuning that experience further and say, okay, we need to account for these kind of scenarios. Here's where we're failing, or this particular fail intent gets triggered again and again. Why is that happening? And understanding that analysis in post-production also helps the design team. And we are working with other companies to understand what analytics are they capturing and how do we bring it back to the designers and make it valuable.
This is interesting. So when we think about like this level of tuning, who's responsible for tuning the prompts? Is it a designer or a developer?
So it's usually a data science team which works with the designers and developers to fine tune it, but this work in between. Traditionally, we saw a lot of development team trying to do this, but they forgot that the content team, especially the writing and linguistics and all those other team members, are actually critical to that part too. So they need to adjust. If you're adjusting the content tone itself, then you need to worry about variations in the content and how are you going to escalate, when are you going to use it. So there's like becomes a team sport, but really we've seen data training team coming in and saying, okay, we are going to fine tune this based on what we have learned. Sometimes what you start realizing is that the issue is not really with your training data, and the issue really is with the content itself. It's the content that's driving bad data for you from the user, bad input from the user. And if you can handle it that way, then it's even faster and better to fix, because that is probably tripping a lot more users than just the NLU engine itself.
So hearing all this, it feels, designers and writers also need to have some basic understanding or level of like technology understanding. So how much do you think they should know about the technology in order to drive successful communications and collaborations?
Somewhat information about it definitely helps. Understanding how intents and energy engines work in a high level definitely helps you design better. But we also I've noticed that being able to interact with your own prototype in a real-time way, being able to actually chat with your prototype helps them get a much better mental model of, am I structuring this conversation properly or not? Human to human interaction is quite different because sometimes when two humans we can see each other, we can see so many visual cues and facial expressions and hand gestures and everything else that machines just can't. And when you're designing these experiences, you can get blindsided by that. So we wanted to give the tool set for them, but not having them to understand exactly how the nitty-gritty of NLU engine will work and all the complexity around it. But at some point, the other team members come in and they take ownership of that part and they are much more well-versed. So they can pick it up and fine-tune it for them. But what we've noticed that having some understanding of it definitely helps in your early design, and then interacting with your design by itself enormously helps you because right away you start seeing all the gaps that you have and you start fine-tuning everything and say, okay, I'm getting this input like this, but I feel like there are other ways I can get this, and have you accounted for that? And before that, you actually are writing training data along with your training data team. And that's valuable interaction because now you come back to your design and say, this is how the user is saying, talking to me, this is the tone of that, that's how my tone should be in terms of replying back.
Interesting. Yeah. This is a very fascinating topic, especially for someone who wants to start new into this industry and they want to know how to collaborate or be successful in the domain. So, what
Mhm.
kind of like recommendations would you give to people who want to get into the space?
Yeah, so there's a lot of resources online that you can follow. We have done a couple of webinars around this topic of how to become a conversation designer, what career path have you taken, and we've interviewed some great conversation designers from all sort of backgrounds, from enterprise conversation designers to entertainment and other places, voice, text, chatbots, and all that. There's some great resources on Twitter. So if you have not following people on Twitter, I highly recommend just follow voice first hashtag and you'll find a lot of good resources there. There's some really good books. One of them is by Kathy Pearl, Voice Interaction Design. I personally found it very useful to understand how to think about voice experiences. And then there are some other really good resources around how to do creative writing in this space. And it's all about multiple skill sets coming together. So if you have a linguistic background, that's really good. If you have a data science background, you're very valuable to this experience design because you can actually help understand the data science part of it and what data set is going to be used to train things. A lot of good information being shared online on this. Google Actions has a good directory of tutorials on how to think about conversation design. So does Alexa. Their team has put quite a bit of data now, tutorials on this stuff. One thing that I would usually recommend is that all of this information is great if you can apply it somewhere. So once you have started reading up a little bit on all of this stuff, start building your own conversation experiences. Nothing beats that. So you can start building some sort of conversation experience and apply these things that you're learning into there and then share with the world and learn from that. And the more you do that, the better you will get at it over time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Obaid. I think these are all very useful resources and listeners would definitely benefit from these. We will make sure we add it into the show notes. So thank you so much for your time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/DAA. That's www.witlingo.com/DAA. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Dr. Maria Artulaki, founder and CEO of Dialogue Connection, talks about explainable VUI design. Until next week, take care.